then I think we should get underway. So welcome everyone to our June web debate. This month we are tackling the question of algorithmic diplomacy, better geopolitical analysis, and concerns about human rights. As you know, Diplo organizes these debates once a month in the context of the International Forum on Diplomatic Training. What we aim to do is to look at new ideas in the area of diplomacy, new practices, evolving topics, and to also give advice for the next generation of young diplomats by looking at these new issues, new contexts, and new tools for diplomats. So today we're looking at algorithmic diplomacy, and this is a vast topic. It seems to be a topic that has gained some interest in the corridors of diplomatic institutions. But having said that, it also seems to be a topic where there's a lot of vagueness and where we don't have a clear definition of what we actually mean by algorithmic diplomacy. Having said that, there seems to be a sense of urgency and a sense of not only interest in the topic, but a sense that we need to look at it in order to prepare ourselves for the future in various ways. So the topic is quite vast, and in order to kind of narrow it down a little bit, we decided to look at three issues in this debate. So first, we're looking at algorithmic diplomacy in the context of geopolitical analysis and public diplomacy. Second, we are looking at the impact of algorithms on human rights. And third, we're looking at something that seems to be located at the intersection of both, which is the question of filter bubbles and online echo chambers that seem to be generated by algorithms where we each live in our very small world of recommended friends or recommended topics. And then the question is, how does it impact geopolitical analysis, so what diplomats can know about the world out there, especially online? How does it impact public diplomacy? And then, importantly, what are the implications for human rights? What are the implications for democratic values? So with these three topics in mind, we have two formidable speakers with us, and I'm very, very glad and very happy to have Mr. Sean Reardon and Mr. Lee Hibbert for this web debate. Sean and Lee, thank you for being here today. It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm extremely happy that you had the time and that you agreed to join us. And let me give a brief introduction to each of them, because they are both extremely accomplished. So Sean is a former British diplomat. He is a visiting fellow at the Klingendahl Institute. He's also a member of the social media team of the Hague Journal on Diplomacy, and also a senior analyst with Wikistrat. And Lee is currently an administrator in the bioethics unit of the Council of Europe, and he's also a senior fellow at DiploFoundation. And today he will be mainly speaking in this latter capacity as a senior fellow at DiploFoundation. Lee is extremely accomplished in questions of internet governance, and he will be focusing on human rights issues because for the last 10 years he has been developing European human rights norms, especially with questions regarding the internet, such as freedom of expression, privacy, the right to be forgotten, the responsibilities of internet companies. So I'm very keen to hear from Sean and Lee in a second. However, given that algorithmic diplomacy is such a vast topic and there's so many different angles we can use to look at it, I've been asked to give a very brief introduction into the topic. So if you allow me another 5 minutes to just give a brief flavor of what are we talking about when we are talking about algorithmic diplomacy. So let me start with a very basic question, and I think this is quite important. What is an algorithm? And I think it is important to acknowledge that algorithms are not necessarily these very fancy things that computers do somewhere in dark corners. So in a sense, an algorithm, the very simplest way to describe it, is a step-by-step description. Algorithms have been with us since we acquired language. So algorithms can be formulated in natural language, the way we speak. They can also be formulated in various computer languages. But I think it's important to keep in mind that both of these things are a possibility. We're not just talking about computers. Algorithms, in the most general sense, are aimed at solving problems. And by being this step-by-step description in order to solve a problem or a computational task, the key thing is that the algorithm will produce the same results, given the same inputs over and over again. So just to give an example, if you have ever followed a cooking recipe or the recipe for a cake, you have followed an algorithm. If you went to a coffee shop this morning, ordered a coffee, the person that made your coffee followed an algorithm. So in essence, algorithms are a description of how to do things. Having said that, we can get a little bit more technical, and I have a couple of definitions here to kind of show you the different kinds of algorithms that are out there. Computational algorithms we're talking about now mainly, and how they can and could potentially be applied in diplomatic practice. So basically I have 5 types of algorithms that have been developed, and with each algorithm there's a certain set of questions associated with it and a certain kind of area of questions in diplomatic practice that they could solve. So a very basic type of algorithm is what is called a classification algorithm, so a 2-class or multi-class classification. And if we apply this to questions in diplomatic practice, for example, such an algorithm could solve questions like, what is the topic of this newspaper article? What is the sentiment of this tweet about this particular policy issue? A second class of algorithms is extremely good at anomaly detection. So basically the question here is this weird? Is this different than what we've seen before? Is this different from what we are used to? So for example, a question related to the practice of diplomacy is this trading pattern different from the country's past trade behavior? Or for example, based on previous email communication with one of our counterparts in this negotiation, is something different? Is that person acting differently now than in previous negotiation rounds? A third type of algorithm is regression, and the statisticians among us will obviously recognize this as regression analysis. Typical questions here involve how much, how many. So for example, related to public diplomacy, such an algorithm could ask, how many Twitter followers will the MFA's account gain next week? Another potential question is, what will the GDP of Spain be in the first quarter? Well, we're past that. What will the GDP of Spain be in the third quarter of 2018? So a bit of prediction here. There are 2 more classifications of algorithms, and here it gets more interesting in the sense that here we get closer to this idea of the algorithm as a black box, as something going on in the algorithm and we don't actually know what is going on, and we're presented with some kind of solution and some kind of outcome, but we don't know what is happening inside. So here we're talking about unsupervised learning, and such algorithms can, for example, solve questions like, how is this data organized? Related to the work of diplomats, relevant questions could be, is there a way of dividing these policy documents into smaller topic groups? Or which types of social media users generally agree with the message of the MFA? Which beneficiaries of consular support are likely to need the same kind of service? And then last but not least, we have machine learning algorithms. And this is something that has been in the press quite recently, quite prominently, and that has gained a lot of attention. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that this is only one type of algorithm solving only one type of question. So machine learning algorithms is basically the question, can a machine decide? And here it is basically outsourcing the decision to the machine. And such decisions could, for example, be a simple question related to the website of the MFA, where should a piece of information be placed on the website in order to gain most attention. And this decision could be based on information about how people view websites. Similarly, another question is for diplomats getting advice from such an algorithm. Should I vote in favor, against, or abstain from this proposal based on my country's context and the negotiation history? So with these types of algorithms, we have information being collected by the algorithm, being fed into the algorithm, and a decision, a recommendation for a decision coming out. The thing to keep in mind is also algorithms have been around for quite a while, and most of these algorithms I just outlined are very familiar to mathematicians, are very familiar to statisticians. But what is new now is algorithms in the context of big data and artificial intelligence. So as we have more and more data gathered from a vast amount of sources, through the internet, through sensors, through satellites, we need to find a way of making sense of these vast amounts of data, and this is where algorithms come in. This is also where quite a number of machine learning algorithms come in. And then related to AI, it is algorithms analyzing big data that eventually enable artificial intelligence. And so algorithms are important in this new context in making sense of big data, in developing AI, and in improving AI. And so this is the kind of new context we're talking about, and this is the relation of algorithms to the other key topics, or the other new topics we're talking about in the area of diplomacy, like big data and artificial intelligence. So in the world of diplomacy, we are familiar with algorithms, especially in the online world, especially in social media, and how algorithms are basically tailoring and shaping our social media experience. And I think this is something that Sean will touch upon later. We've also seen applications for algorithms in the judicial sector, where algorithms are used to make recommendations, for example, about decisions about bail and similar things. So what I'm trying to say is, although algorithms are, on the one hand, quite an old topic, the applications to diplomacy are a new development. And these are just two examples. And now to fully bring this back again to diplomacy and diplomatic practice, let me outline three very broad ways in which diplomacy and algorithms relate to each other. So algorithms have the potential to change the tools that are available to diplomats, that are at the disposal of diplomats. Algorithms also influence the topics on the diplomatic agenda. So in that sense, what are the key issues? How are they discussed? And how are these new topics on the international agenda impacted by the emergence of algorithms, as one example. And then the third, algorithms and diplomacy, algorithms as impacting the very environment in which diplomacy takes place. So if we look at the online environment and echo chambers and filter bubbles, I think we have a very good example here, but we also have examples related to human rights, democratic values, and this very environment in which diplomacy takes place. So with these three areas, or these three ways in which algorithms potentially impact diplomacy, I will stop, and I would like to hand over to our speakers, who will add further insights and really bring us into the topic after this very brief introduction. So I would like to start with Sean. And I think, if I understand correctly, Sean will talk a little bit about foreign policy analysis through algorithms and public diplomacy. But without further ado, over to Sean.
Okay, thank you very much, Katharina, and thank you for that introduction, which does make my task much easier in that I don't need to start by explaining algorithms, and I can leap straight in. As you suggested, I want to look at two areas. One area is the use of algorithms in big data analysis and the advantages and disadvantages from the point of view of policy making or doing diplomacy. And the other area is the use of algorithms in social media and in search machines, and what that means for how we do diplomacy as well. To start with the first part, I mean, there are clearly great potential applications for big data analysis, both in foreign policy analysis or geopolitical analysis and in consular analysis or consular work. Touching on the last one first, because I want to say less about it, I mean, in theory it would be possible for governments already to use big data analysis, scraping information from social media to identify where their citizens are, where they're travelling to, why they're travelling there, and what they're doing when they get there. And the potential advantage of that is when you get a consular crisis, instead of sending out a general social media message like, please get out of that area or report to your embassy or whatever, you can actually tailor it for where people are and what they're doing. The drawback of that, of course, is, and this is something I think Lee will touch on, it's got some fairly mega privacy implications, which is going to be of concern. Because you might say that we're going to use this data we've collected and the analysis of it for positive purposes, but in fact other governments will use it for social control, as we're beginning to see in China. The other side is using it for geopolitical analysis or for foreign policy analysis, and then basing policy decisions on that analysis. Now, the problem here is not so much a privacy problem, although that could still exist. It becomes the nature of algorithms. Essentially, we've got two kinds of algorithms. As you've mentioned, we've got algorithms that are actually designed by a programmer who programs these algorithms to do the analysis for us. And then we've got the algorithms that teach themselves, the machine learning algorithms. And both, I think, pose quite severe problems. The central problem is that with designed algorithms, the person who designs the algorithm is not the person who uses the output. The output is used by diplomats and policymakers who have an assumption of objectivity, because this is algorithm, it's math, we did math at school, this is objective stuff. But actually it's not objective, because the algorithm is going to reflect the epistemological prejudices of its designer. And the designer might not necessarily be an expert in international relations or diplomacy. The people using it are definitely not experts in how you design algorithms. So for them it becomes a black box, a black box in which they may put too much confidence in making their judgments. Now, we've already had an example of this in financial markets. If you go back to the financial crisis in 2008, one of the problems is you have the quants, the young mathematicians and physicists, designing highly complex models. They know how to design highly complex models. They don't necessarily know a lot about how economies work. And then you have the investment bankers who are making the decisions on the basis of the product of these models, who don't understand how the models work. And we saw the consequences with some very bad decisions being made about investment. I think we run the risk of this happening with using algorithms in foreign policy making as well. Sometimes it's argued that machine learning makes it better, because if they're not designed, if the algorithm teaches itself, then it should in principle be more objective. Actually, I think it could even make things worse, because in machine learning, the machine learns, or the algorithm learns, or designs itself by being fed data. And it's the way in which the data is fed to it which shapes how the algorithm functions. So there is still a non-objective role there, which is choosing the data to feed into to train the algorithm. Problem there is, not only is it not objective, there's still a bias built into it, but we understand less about how the bias works, because the bias is almost generated by the algorithm itself, working on the data it's being fed. But we don't necessarily know how the algorithm uses that data. So again, we've got a black box problem of people trying to use this information, use this analysis, and not understanding where it comes from, and not being able to interrogate it, not being able to go back to it and say, well, why did you reach that decision? And when you're a human analyst, you can always beat them around the head and say, look, young Mr. Roden, why did you do that? Why did you come up with that conclusion, as often happened to me in the past? I think leaving that to one side, the second area that, there's one more problem actually that I should mention, and that is we're creating yet another vulnerability for cyber attack. Algorithms doing big data analysis, by definition, will be online. By definition, they are hackable. And this could become a new form of covert operation, to hack into the algorithms doing the big data analysis in a foreign ministry, to change a government's conclusions about what's going on in the world, or change a government's conclusions about what it should be doing by changing the data that's being fed to it, or changing the analytical framework that's being created by the big data analysis. The other aspect I wanted to pick up briefly is the way that algorithms drive social media and search engines. And my thesis here is that these algorithms are making information warfare easier and making public diplomacy harder. And that's true because they, as you said in your introduction, Katerina, they are feeding or reinforcing the filter bubbles or the echo chambers which are already creating our societies. So as the echo chambers get more reinforced by social media, more of the news and the opinions that we receive are decided by these algorithms. Now, in the case of information warfare, the aim of information warfare is essentially to exaggerate these echo chambers, to fragment the social discourse in liberal democracies, to polarize the societies, to undermine the narratives of governments and their ability to deliver on policy decisions. To do that, you don't have to put across a coherent message. In fact, you don't. You fragment your messages. You fragment your fake news. And then the algorithms driving social media will make sure they get to the echo chamber that agrees with you. So that the fake news is arriving with the people who are predisposed to believe the fake news, who want to believe that fake news, which makes it much harder to fight against. The problem for public diplomacy is that you don't want to polarize the debate, you want to win the debate. You want to influence public opinion as a whole by engaging with it. But if you start depending on social media for doing that, or you start depending on search machines or things like YouTube, you're only going to arrive at the people who already agree with you, because the algorithm is going to take your views and deliver them to the people who already agree with you, which makes it much harder to engage with the people who don't agree with you, the people you actually need to convince to win your arguments. So I think because of that, we need to start thinking a lot harder about how we engage with these algorithms. We need to think a lot harder about how we engage with the internet companies who use the algorithms as part of their business model, and how we can try and convince them that it's in their interest to give us more information about these algorithms so that we can start designing policies to escape their tyranny and start broadening out the debate. I think that's probably enough for now, or possibly a bit more than enough.
Thank you, Sean. Brilliant. I think this gives us a lot to discuss. But before I go into the questions, which are already coming in, I'll hand over to Lee for his brief introduction, his key points. We'll focus on, I believe, human rights in particular. Over to you, Lee. You need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you yet. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Is it okay? Yes, okay. Sorry. Thank you, Katerina. Thank you to Sean for starting and for allowing me to build on this. I'd like to say a few things. Human rights are rather vast, and in a few minutes it's quite a challenge. So a few words of introduction, followed by a few references to key human rights and their limitations, because it's the limitations where it becomes a bit tricky. Some words of context. I'd like to point out what's new about the use of algorithms, what's new compared to what's from what we had before. I'd like to address some concerns about the question of autonomy and the use of data. And I'd like to talk about a little bit at the end about concerns about the rights, sort of the roles and responsibilities of different actors, the state, of course, and also the roles of the private sector, which are the platforms, you know, carrying these contents that we're talking about. So on that, just to say that, as I think you said, algorithms are not new. You know, they've been around quite a long time. I think the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of expression has said exactly that. In the Council of Europe, actually, there's a convention on the automatic processing of personal data, which is over 30 years old. So we've been talking about automatic processing for many years, for decades, actually. So it's not new. And I think it's quite safe to say that algorithms are everywhere or becoming everywhere, ubiquitous in all the things that we do, which we don't necessarily see. It's a part of modern life. It's part of accessing the internet. It's a part of this revolution. But also, I think it's important to point out that it's in its infancy still. The speed of technological change is still very, very, very important to understand that in this infancy, in this tech change, it's a challenge for everybody, whichever sector that you're in. It seems that the blurring of the boundaries between what is state and what is non-state, what is public, what is private, is everywhere. I was in a meeting last week with librarians who curate information and transmit knowledge, and they had the same problems regarding these blurring of these boundaries with companies. So in everyday life, we're affected by algorithms, profiling, assessments, predictions of everyday things in our lives, which leads to challenges. And Sean mentioned some of them, and you too, Katerina, and there are many. But to point out from the beginning that human rights are really the first and foremost the purview of states. They sign the conventions which protect your human rights. So they have a legal obligation. They are the primary duty bearer to make sure those rights are protected, that they are clearly transmitted and understood, and one can predict one's behavior accordingly. therein lies the challenge with actors which are coming along with very new trends and ways to do things with information, and the problems we see. So the human rights which are, I think, of particular importance are civil and political rights. We've mentioned about social media, which means about freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, of course the right to privacy and to personal data protection. But one particular right of particular importance, which is in the news a lot, is discrimination, the right not to be discriminated against. It's interesting, just looking at the news recently, that on the BBC website I saw just a news just the other day about Norman, the AI psychopathic algorithm, which is a test, if you like, by the MIT Media Lab to look at very dark content in dark places on the web, to see how it reacts to that and how it crunches that data. And of course, it's fair to say that what comes in, which is rather dark, what it emits, what it produces, is also rather dark. So another example of that is in 2016 is the Microsoft's chatbot Tay, which was interacting with social media in a sort of autonomous fashion, and ended up being rather racist in his discourse. So once again, sort of garbage in is the adage, garbage in, garbage out. It really depends on the quality of the data. And more recently, again with MIT, was this facial recognition study whereby there was a much greater recognition of white men's faces as opposed to females, which had a low recognition, and also of non-white skinned people. So the algorithms are working, but it really depends on the data, and it really depends on how they crunch that data, of course. And you've mentioned about democracy. We'll probably go to that later. But of course, freedom of expression, freedom of the media, social media, it's right in the middle of algorithms. Of course, you search using algorithms. How would you find information otherwise? It's very important to understand they have a very important role to play in sorting data, sorting information, so you get to what you want. I think the issue lies in how automated that is, and the fears of blocking too much content, of chilling forms of expression, even the media. And there are cases of the courts which look at these issues more and more, that when you overly broadly block and take down content, whether that be voluntarily via the platform or via a court order, there are challenges regarding the legal basis, regarding the importance of protecting expression, the freedom to offend, shock, and disturb, as has been underlined so many times, and the importance of ensuring that we have diversity and tolerance and a pluralistic information society online. So therein lies the concern, which is that going into echo chambers reduces our access to information, polarizes opinions, and leads to perhaps arguably less diversity. One of the big rights, of course, is the right to privacy, and also in that you've mentioned big data, which is not personal data, it doesn't have the same level of protection. But the question of profiling, both profiling and big data are okay. It's accepted practices. It's how it intersects with the protection of personal data, and whether, for example, data can become personal and therefore should be afforded protection of that personal data as part of a human right, to the right to privacy. And within that, so that's just one or two rights. I mean, that we can go to political rights. There is discussion. There are examples of it being used in the court systems for sentencing, helping helping judges, or helping with predictive policing in hotspots, and other things besides. But the concern is that with all of these things, is that the algorithms, it's the data they receive, it's the quality of the data they receive, and it's the level of autonomy which matters. The more autonomy, the less human agency, the less discretion, could lead to reinforced bias, issues of discrimination which come from the data which is input into the algorithms. So the fact that we're discussing that now in academic works, etc., is already a good thing. I think it's just a matter of time before we see these things built more and more into algorithms. And on that point, I'd like to say that I think we have to look at the positive and the negative. I mean, we will always need to collect and process data. Maybe algorithms are more neutral, but are their results, are they fair and balanced? That can be discussed all day long. I don't think we should overly demonize them either. I think they're there. We shouldn't blame the tech. Of course, algorithms by their design are value laden, and therefore they need to be understood that these things are designed by people, by humans, and their implementation and application are by humans. Maybe the humans are the ones which are just inherently biased. Of course, that's where we're going. But I think what's new, I think which is key for this discussion, is that there's lots of data being generated. There's 156 million emails being generated per minute, 16 million SMSs, 4.1 million YouTube video clips are uploaded. You know, the data, the currency of the internet is data. There is great new value. This is why the share prices are rocketing for certain companies, by taking existing data and repurposing it, making new data from other data, and of course that data about you becomes, if you like, is a challenge, because of course, have you consented to that reuse of that data? You know, what happens? So the power of this data to nudge and to influence behaviors, you've mentioned, I think, is also very important. But I just want to go back, and I'll try to wrap up by saying that the question of autonomy of the algorithms is very important. As you mentioned, machine learning, and then one step further, artificial intelligence means more autonomy and less human agency. So I think there's a feeling that people are losing control of things, and therefore what's key is that as they become more autonomous, they have more power to decide without humans there. So where does the human interaction come in? Where does the right to explanation come in, to information, to choice, etc.? This is what we see come out of the GDPR and also the modernization of Convention 108, which is about trying to take control of information as a user. So the autonomy in the use of imperfect data, of this black box, this proprietary algorithms, which the companies don't want you to see too much about them, the transparency. They may be complicated, but too much will give their own secret source away. But I think ultimately, what's a real concern is that we have we really fully mastered algorithms and what they can be used for good, of course, the choice, the information, the lack of self-determination in dealing with these algorithms, the unintended consequences when we talk about discrimination of classes, of groups of people, you know, which is really a rather blanket approach, which doesn't seem to work, which is not at all in keeping with human rights. And becoming a bit darker, and I will conclude, is that these things exist, and their misuse and their abuse can exist. We see the abuse with the discussion with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. These are psychometric profiling. We see it with the mass surveillance discussions in Snowden in 2016. We see it in the tension between states and non-state actors about who is responsible for what, who protects what from whom. When you think about the case of Apple and FBI, for example, with the unlocking of an Apple iPhone, you know, who trumps who with regard to access to that telephone for a criminal investigation. So there's a lot of tension there. It's still in its infancy, and we can talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Lee and Sean. Thank you for getting us started. And just by looking at the questions we've already received in the chat, there's lots of interest and lots of points that people have taken up and are viewing quite critically. I mean, for me, what I found really interesting, which I picked up from your introduction, Lee, is this blurring of the boundaries between public and private, between state and non-state, and I think that's really important to think through for the practice of diplomacy. And then from Sean, just this example of the use of social media in diplomacy and how this relates to all three areas, how algorithms impact diplomacy. It relates to the tools diplomats can use. It relates to policy making regarding the use of algorithms in social media, and it relates to changes in the very environment in which diplomatic practice takes place. So there's a lot to discuss here, and I think the best thing to do is to jump right into the questions. I have one question from Professor Yolanda Spies, and this goes directly to Sean, and then I'm going to take another question from Ambassador Stefano Baldi for both of you. So Professor Spies asks you, Sean, directly, are algorithms of any help to diplomats in an era of direct, dotted rocketman diplomacy? I think it's a very good question in the sense of is diplomatic practice really changing, and to what extent? And I think this is a question we've been debating for quite a while, and it's really interesting. And I'm curious to see what you're going to say. And then the question from Ambassador Baldi, which is regarding diplomatic training. He asks, are current diplomats prepared to make the best use, or any use really, of the opportunities provided by algorithmic diplomacy? And how should future generations of diplomats be prepared? And here maybe a question for both of you, just to hear your two different perspectives, maybe to give 3 key points of how to prepare diplomats better, or what future diplomats need to be aware of in this area of algorithmic diplomacy. So I think because you have essentially 2 questions, Sean, let's start with you. I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how algorithms would help with Rocketman and Dotard. Because in a sense, we're seeing something that's, in one sense, something quite old-fashioned, which is 2 hostile sides exchanging insults. And when we became accustomed to that throughout the Cold War. What's new, I think, is the way that Trump uses Twitter. But he's kind of unique in that he does it in a very uncontrolled way, a very anarchic way, which clearly undermines American foreign policy, makes American foreign policy much harder to do. And I'm not sure there's that much we can learn from bad practice by a lunatic. It's not a great case study for us. I think turning to the training thing, 3 things we could do to make training better. I think first of all, diplomats have to understand algorithms and have to understand how social media work and why algorithms are limiting on what social media do, and why algorithms make information warfare so much easier. And I'm not sure, for example, that the EU Stratcom East, with its anti-information warfare programs, has the remotest idea how algorithms work. Because if they do, they're not taking advantage of that knowledge in trying to fight back. Diplomats certainly have to have more technical knowledge of things like search engine optimization. I think most diplomats, if you say that to them, wouldn't have the remotest idea what you're talking about. But it's absolutely essential in terms of trying to get your message across. I think the third thing is that diplomats, well, if you let me have 4, because the 2 I think quite important. One is, if diplomats are going to use algorithms for policy analysis, they've got to understand that they're not objective, that there are limitations on how valuable they are, and that you must be willing to question them, even if it's only looking out the window sometimes to see what's actually happening outside. You don't always need that kind of depth of analysis. And then the final thing I'd say in terms of combating information warfare is to be more imaginative about how we use online platforms, not just sticking to established social media, but thinking about how we can use online platforms for scenario building, for simulation exercises, how we can target the people that we want to talk to, rather than just dumping stuff in social media and then walking away, which tends to be what we do at the moment.
Shall I come in? Yeah. Thank you. I just want to echo what you've just said, Sean. Of course, it makes total sense. I mean, I've worked with quite a few diplomats in recent years, and I've been involved in many different internet-related discussions and events on all sorts of topics. How to prepare diplomats better? I think there needs to be a reflection about the role of the state in a place where there are no boundaries, or meaning the internet, meaning technology, where the ability to understand that you're dealing with a cross-border phenomenon which has its own belief system. I think what's really important, which has not been fully understood yet, is that the established order of things for a diplomat is not the established order of things for somebody in the tech sector on the internet. The belief system for the internet is something about free flow of information, of interoperability, of there's a lot of principles discussed about this, but they do coincide with things that we know. But the whole order of life and internet is not something which is very very like the established order offline, let's say. So I think that the internet governance principles that we mentioned that you can look at from the Net Mundial event in 2014, the process principles are really part of a belief system which are different to what may have been learned by diplomats. And I think that comes down to the idea that the question of governance, how to govern. I mean, governance meaning multi-stakeholder. Though these are known terms, but we keep talking about governance and multi-stakeholder dialogue, respecting responsibilities and roles of different actors. That comes out of the UN's work on the World Summit on Information Society. But we haven't necessarily clinched yet an effectively successful working model for internet for governance between state and non-state actors. So somehow there's a need to understand the new realities. Is it geopolitical? Well, this is involving non-state actors, however, and the ability to communicate and collaborate with and cooperate with non-state actors, and to be open enough and to understand the cross-border and sort of different belief system of those other actors who can affect the role of diplomats in helping to ensure that human rights are protected online.
Thank you so much for both of your responses. And I think I'm just going to follow right up from there, because Leo mentioned this need for bringing different kinds of stakeholders together and finding governance models to do that. And obviously we're all familiar with multi-stakeholderism and internet governance. But it's also an interesting question on a smaller scale, and that is the question of if diplomats are starting to use new tools for which they depend on technical people, programmers, technologists. How do we bring these two groups together? And Professor Spies kind of touches upon this issue, and she's wondering if you have this fear of the black box of the algorithm that is designed by technical people but then used by diplomats, would one option be to bring diplomats and programmers and technologists together for joint training or to foster a collaboration between them? And it actually reminds me of something I picked up very early on from your presentation, Sean, this question of how do we bring these two worlds together, and how do we make sure diplomats have all the information they need when they're using algorithms, keeping in mind that they are obviously not programmers, only users. So how do we bring the producers, the programmers, and the users, the diplomats, together in effective ways, maybe already in ministries of foreign affairs, maybe already in diplomatic training? So I think that's a really, really interesting question. Then a question from Ambassador Uweis, which I'm really happy to see, by the way. So he's asking, how do we use algorithms? Shouldn't we be focusing on using algorithms for peaceful purposes, for echoing positive messages of peace? And it reminds me, Leo, of what you said, this kind of the dark side of algorithms trained on the dark side of the internet, or even algorithms trained on the normal internet and social media, how they become biased, racist, misogynist, etc., etc. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that question of how do we deal with this bias, and that goes back to a comment from Ginger Park as well. And what is the task here for diplomats, using algorithms for good, and how to deal with the dark side of algorithms? I think keeping with the tradition we seem to have established, I would start with Sean, and then over to Lee.
Okay, if I may, I'd like to pick up on something that Lee said as well, in that the culture of the tech sector and the culture of the internet, and how diplomats find that difficult and governments find that difficult. I think there's another side to this, and this is how Silicon Valley, the tech people, are actually finding the culture of geopolitics difficult. And they're clashing against geopolitics. So whereas traditionally it said there are no boundaries in the internet, actually of course there are. China's firewall, the Great Firewall of China, has carved off a great area of Chinese sovereignty in internet. The extent to which governments are constantly trying to control content, insisting that racist content must be removed, the Germans putting restrictions on pro-Nazi content or Holocaust-related content. So there is a side in which governments are beginning to impose themselves on the internet, ever more pursuing kind of internet sovereignty idea. And I think the internet companies are having great problem when they're clashing up against that. So the sense in which both sides need to learn in this. On the issue of algorithms for peaceful purposes, I mean, it's a bit like diplomacy for peaceful purposes. I think it's kind of misunderstanding about diplomacy. It's always about international peace and understanding. Well, only if the government decides that's what its diplomats should be doing. Diplomacy can be as much about promoting warfare as it can about promoting peace. If we think of British diplomacy in 2003, it was not about avoiding the Iraq war, it was about fighting under better conditions. And I fear that's going to be the same in cyberspace, that diplomats are going to be trying to pursue their national interests in cyberspace, which may be peaceful, may be promoting better understanding, but may not be. And I think if we look at the way that some countries are using the internet, some countries are taking advantage of algorithms to undermine Western societies and undermine our coherence, then I think that should be the first thing that we're worried about, and we should be engaging with that. So in terms of putting the tech sector and diplomats together, it's an excellent idea. One of the things I've always thought we should be doing, because one of our problems, and perhaps this goes back to the question about peaceful purposes as well, one of our problems is that diplomats take stuff off the shelf. They try and use off-the-shelf software packages or programs or apps or whatever, and they come with all the limitations of the algorithms already built in. They're designed for another purpose. They're designed for commercial purposes. I think we need to get business techies together with diplomats to start tailor designing tools that diplomats can use, and trying to get diplomats influencing where future design is going and understanding the implications of future technologies, in particular things like machine learning, which probably is going to be as big a game changer in the future as digital technologies have been over the last 5-10 years.
I think Lee might have some internet problems. Lee, just let us know when you're back, and then we feed you straight in. So one really interesting question, and it's a very broad question, which therefore I really like. And it's also a question we often encounter when we look at big data and AI, but applied here to algorithms. Atif Ahmed asks, I'm wondering about the use of algorithms in the future, which is a good question. Will algorithmic big data analysis replace human analysis in the future? And Sean, I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on this, and let me add to what extent, if any.
I think this is one of the dangers that I've been trying to warn against, is that if we allow algorithmic analysis to replace human analysts altogether, then we lose control of our policy-making processes, because we don't understand the black boxes that are generating the foreign policy analysis. And we need to have some kind of check that says this does not make sense, or we think there are other things going on in here. And also bear in mind that a lot of the analysis we want to do is not necessarily big data analysis. If we do, there's a wonderful book just been published, which I highly commend, by Marcus Holmes, about face-to-face diplomacy and the advantages of face-to-face diplomacy in identifying intentions. Now, given that I think ever more important for us is going to be identifying the intentions of other governments or other actors, that kind of intention identifying through face-to-face knowledge, face-to-face interaction is going to remain essential. So that at the very least, I would say that the human analysis, the human diplomacy is going to have to accompany using algorithms if we're going to understand intentions, motivations correctly, and avoid the kind of misunderstandings that lead to conflict.
Yeah, very much agreed. And I think there's a fine balance to be struck to, on the one hand, rely
Shall I come
on.
in? Yes?
Yes, of course. Sorry. Good to have you back,
Can you hear me?
Lee. Please go ahead. Yeah. Lee, we can't hear you. One option is to switch off your video. Either check if you have unmuted yourself, and if there's still a problem, you can switch off your video.
Better?
And we can just try again.
Okay, can you hear me or not? Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? No?
Yes.
You can hear me? Okay, I'm really sorry. I don't know what happened. Apologies. The question of algorithms for good. I think that what would be very important, that's quite a general question. I mean, of course, any algorithm which helps to promote whichever good thing, whether it be to do with the exercise of human rights, of course, would be very welcome. But I think in terms of how algorithms deal with issues which relate to human rights, like when you block content, when you take down content through social media. I mean, Google, for example, tweaks its algorithms over 100 times a year, for example. I mean, you know, it's clear that companies can do that. And but how do they do it? On what basis? What criteria do they use? I think it's very important for diplomats to work with companies to say, look, we have to protect these rights. There are limitations. We do things to protect people, to ensure there is national security, but we have to do them in a way which is very narrowly circumscribed, and we must make sure that we don't create a chilling effect on the internet with regard to our role as the state. So please work with us in terms of helping, you know, if you're going to take down content, if you're going to do certain things, make sure it has a legal basis. Let's make sure that it's a measure of last resort, and it's very narrowly circumscribed. So I think what would be very important is to work out the algorithms for these companies in terms of the content which are passing over them, and to make sure that they respect the balance of human rights, both the rights and any limitations where necessary. That's the first thing. And the second thing is how to deal with bias. It's, again, I think algorithms, we're talking about them, there's a lot of academic research, but I think rolling up one's sleeves, again, working together with companies and working out really how, sitting down with companies and diplomats and working these things, that would be very important. I think you mentioned machine learning and AI. We're on the crest of a new wave, which is very exciting. At the same time, very autonomous. When you hear about stories between machines talking to machines, and then, for example, in an AI context, and the machines then change the language and no longer start talking to each other in English, but in another language they create, or a truncated language, which means that, you know, they were talking together. You have to wonder how autonomous and how much lack of human agency we can stand. So the key there is to ensure that algorithms, however autonomous, are accompanied by humans. The humans at certain stages, have to validate and have to explain to them how these algorithms work. The question of intelligibility, explanation is absolutely fundamental. If we don't get that right, for me, this is a red line. If we don't get that right, maybe it's too late, but if we don't get that right, if we don't work between state and non-state actors to ensure that there is an understanding about, what is happening with regard to content issues, with regard to how services are being provided, surveillance and whatever, then we really are, I think, perhaps in trouble if we are unable to understand it, if we're unable to validate it, to certify it, and to make sure
Okay, I think Lee again is facing some connection problems, which is always ironic when we talk about new technology and the use of new technology in diplomacy, that sometimes or very often
these algorithms go in the right way.
We're still stuck with seemingly little problems like internet connectivity, which is a good reminder that the world is very unequal in terms of the ability to use these kind of technologies, and even in terms of access. kind of trying to draw everything together.
I think that's a major job for diplomats to ensure that.
Trying to draw everything together. There are still a couple of questions in the chat, which
we
for
don't
now,
lose sight and lose control of autonomous functioning machines and data, which concerns people.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. So as I said, there's still a couple of questions in the chat, which for now I'm going to leave there. I think there are other opportunities to address them as we follow up on this web debate. I think it is time to wrap up, and I think we have heard a lot of interesting facets of this question of what is algorithmic diplomacy and what does algorithmic diplomacy mean for the future of diplomatic practice and for the future of diplomatic training in particular. I enjoyed hearing about geopolitical analysis, about the use of social media and public diplomacy. But I also found it very interesting to hear about human rights aspects. And one of the key things that I think we touched upon, which is going to be, as it seems from this debate, one of the key questions for the future is how do we promote programmers and technologists on the one hand and diplomats on the other hand working together on this very kind of individual level within ministries of foreign affairs, but then also on a larger level, how do we promote public-private partnerships in the sense of how technology is designed and how technology is used, and how do we get internet companies into this dialogue, and how do we get the kind of transparency and the kind of cooperation that especially Lee seems to advocate for into this policy realm. And I think diplomats will play a very important role here. But to what extent and what is possible within this realm is a very big question. I would like to invite Sean, and I'm not sure about Lee, but let's start with Sean. I would like to invite you for some final words, some final reflections to wrap us up and to give us some points to think about as we part ways.
Okay. I think for me the important thing that's come out of here is, as you said, we need to find ways of getting diplomats and technology specialists together. Diplomats need to bring their skill sets. The techniques and mindsets of diplomats can be helpful in helping us deal with these algorithm problems, in negotiating the problems that arrive in cyberspace. But at the same time, we've got to get the companies engaged, the tech companies. And I saw one of the last questions on the chat was, how do we influence companies? Well, actually, there are some ways of influencing companies. One of them we've seen already is that governments that have market power or that can leverage the market attractiveness, like the European Union or like the US, can impose legislation on companies, as we've seen with the General Data Protection Regulation, which in effect companies can have to obey if they want to operate in Europe. And we've seen that with anti-corruption legislation as well in the US and in the UK. China has enormous leverage to influence companies. So there is one way we're going to see companies influenced, and possibly complicated if we start seeing the Chinese setting one set of regulations, the Europeans setting another set of regulations, and companies having to choose between the two, which would be complicated. The other way we can influence companies is one I mentioned. They do not want information warfare carried out on their platforms, because if they do have information warfare carried out on their platforms, then it's going to make it very unattractive for the marketers that they depend on. On the question of human judgment I saw on the chat, I'd just say two things about human judgment. It's easier to interrogate than an algorithmic black box. You can go back and question in a very immediate way what its biases, what its prejudices are. And the second thing is, we understand it. We know it's biased. We know that human judgment is not perfectly objective, and we take that's part of the process. And finally, looking to the future, I've been doing some work recently on laws which are lethal autonomous weapon systems. And I wonder perhaps if we look towards the future, we should be thinking about PADS, peaceful autonomous diplomatic systems, the machine learning diplomat, which will get rid of all of us. Apart from that, thanks very much for inviting me. It's been great.
Thank you, Sean. Wonderful suggestion at the end. I think we should work more on this acronym. I think it will take off from here, I'm sure. Lee is back. Lee, can I ask you for, we're basically in the final words now, and can I ask you for maybe 30 seconds of your final reflection, your way of wrapping up the debate from your perspective?
I think, okay, very quickly. So I just want to really underline, and I apologize for the dropping of the feed. I think more reflection needs to be had on regarding the autonomous use of machines which collect information and make decisions, and the step-by-step process of humans being accompanying humans in that process of going towards more, particularly more AI. I think clearly there is still no. I challenge the common ground between state and non-state actors, private sector and state authorities. The roles and responsibilities of each are clearly something to keep discussing. We need to grasp the technical, as Sean has said. We cannot ignore that, and I've come across too many diplomats in my time who perhaps don't understand it because they say, oh, it's technical, it's not my job. I think we need to understand that at least some of the challenges there, if not the necessary details. And the question of liability, where does the buck stop? We haven't discussed that necessarily, but if something is autonomous and works without any human manipulation, who has responsibility for that? And that discussion about the law and liability, I think that leads to the work of the UN, and I think what Sean has mentioned is that's something worth discussing too. But again, it's all in its infancy. We need to work it out together. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank both Mr. Sean Reedon and Mr. Lee Hibbert for a wonderful web debate. Not an easy topic because we're looking to the future and we're discussing something that is not well defined and where many things are still under development. There are so many details and so much food for thought as we keep working on this issue and keep developing our perspective on algorithmic diplomacy. It was absolutely wonderful to see and wonderful to now have this list of different issues to keep in mind and this advice for diplomatic training and this advice for, at least this call for bringing diplomats and technical people together more in various ways. So in that sense, to echo one of the people in the chat, thanks for the great discussion. Thanks for being here and taking the time. I would also like to thank our audience for lots of questions, lots of interesting, challenging, critical, as well as hopeful and positive questions. It is always a pleasure, and obviously this debate wouldn't work without your contribution. So without further ado, basically let me say thanks to Sean and Lee. It's been an absolute pleasure. The next web debate will take place on July 3rd. You can already see the link there. We will be talking about tools for cyber mediation, kind of continuing with our looking at diplomacy and new technology. But for now, let me thank Sean and Lee again. Let me thank our audience. We will follow up with the video recording, and we will follow up with a summary of the debate to continue the discussion. But for now, thank you so much.